With one last deep breath, he opened the door. The future was waiting. Princess Velara sat on her golden throne, looking down at the galaxy maps spread across the table in front of her. The alien world she ruled was beautiful, with shimmering cities and towering castles. Her people respected her, even feared her, but Velara was not happy. She had everything a ruler could want: wealth, power, and luxury. But there was something missing in her life. Velara was lonely. Her palace was enormous, filled with servants who obeyed her every command. But none of them spoke to her as a friend. They were just there to do her bidding, to wait on her, to serve her. There was no one who truly understood her, no one to confide in. Every night, she would retire to her chambers and look out at the stars, wondering if she would ever find someone who could fill the emptiness in her heart. She was the ruler of millions, feared and respected, but when the doors to her room closed, she was alone with her thoughts. Her advisors had always told her that power was all she needed. "You are the princess of the stars, Your Highness," they would say. "Your strength alone will ensure your place in history." But Velara had started to question those words. Power was great, but it didn't bring happiness. It didn't bring companionship. She wanted more than just obedient subjects. She wanted someone who would see her as more than just a princess, someone who would care for her as a person, not as a ruler. Velara stared at the stars and thought about the strange, distant planet she had heard about, the humans. Her advisors spoke of their strength and resilience, how they could survive in the harshest conditions, how they worked together, and how they valued loyalty. It was these qualities that intrigued Velara. She had never met a human, but the idea of them captivated her. She thought that maybe, just maybe, they could help her in a way no one else could. She had always been taught that humans were weak, primitive creatures. But that was before she learned more about them. They were brave, resourceful, and surprisingly strong. The idea of bringing a few of them to her world began to appeal to her. She had never used them as slaves before, but perhaps that was the answer. If she could have a few humans at her side, they could serve her, be her personal attendants, and she could finally have someone to talk to. Maybe they wouldn't be like the others who only obeyed her commands without question. She made her decision. The next day, Velara gave her orders. Her guards were to go to a distant planet and bring back a few humans. She told them to choose those who would be useful to her, strong men and women who would not fear her. They would live in her palace, serve her, and most importantly, keep her company. Velara was sure that having them close would fill the emptiness inside her. She could teach them about her world, about her life, and in return, they would offer her something the others couldn't: loyalty. When the humans arrived, they were confused. They had never imagined that their lives would take such a strange turn. They were from Earth, a planet far away from Velara's. They had no idea why they had been chosen, but they could see the fear in the eyes of the other creatures as they were led into the princess's grand palace. These people, who were once free, now found themselves as captives in the service of a powerful alien ruler. They tried to fight at first, but the alien guards were too strong. They had no choice but to obey. And so, they became slaves. Velara watched them from a distance as they were brought into her palace. There were 3 of them, 2 men and 1 woman. She studied them carefully. The man named Jurek was tall and muscular, with dark hair and strong eyes. Lena, the woman, was smaller but clever. She had a calm, intelligent expression, and Velara could tell she was not easily frightened. The other man, Marcus, was quiet and seemed skilled in combat, judging by the way he carried himself. Velara had expected them to fight back more, but there was something about them that made her curious. They were strong, yes, but they were also different from the creatures she was used to ruling. These humans didn't seem afraid of her, at least, not in the way she had expected. They were not cowering in fear. Instead, they stood tall and met her gaze, even though they knew they were in her power. For the first time in a long while, Velara felt something stir inside her, an emotion she couldn't quite name. It wasn't fear, and it wasn't the power she had always felt over others. It was something else, something strange. She wanted to know more about them. She wanted to see if they could truly be the companions she had longed for. The humans were brought to her chambers, and Valara spoke to them for the first time. "You will serve me," she said, her voice cold but not unkind. "But you will also be treated with respect. I want you to understand that. I do not treat you as mere property, but as valuable servants." The humans said nothing. They didn't respond. They didn't have to. They had no choice. But inside, Valara couldn't help but feel a small sense of satisfaction. She had finally done something that felt different. She had control, yes, but for once, it didn't feel like she was alone. Valara turned away from the humans and watched them carefully from a distance. She would have them serve her, but she also wanted to understand them. She would not make the mistake of treating them as less than what they were. She had the feeling that they would teach her something she had never expected. As the night grew darker, Valara looked up at the stars again. For the first time in years, she felt that maybe, just maybe, things could change. The humans' arrival, the journey from Earth to Valara's planet, was long and harsh. The humans, Jarek, Lena, and Marcus, had been pulled from their homes with little explanation. They had been forced onto an alien ship, their lives turned upside down in an instant. At first, they thought it was a mistake. They believed they had been captured by some enemy, but soon they learned the truth. They were being taken to serve a princess on a distant world. When the ship finally landed, they were led off by strange alien guards. The landscape outside was nothing like Earth. The sky above them was purple, with 2 moons hanging low, casting an eerie light over the land. The ground was rocky and barren, with strange plants growing in clusters, glowing faintly. The humans couldn't believe what they were seeing. It was like something from a nightmare, a world so foreign it didn't seem real. Jarek looked around nervously, his hand resting on the hilt of the weapon they had been given for protection, though he knew it would do little good against the powerful alien guards. Lena, always the calm one, kept her eyes focused ahead. She could tell that this wasn't some random mistake. Whatever was happening, they were in the hands of someone far more powerful than they could imagine. Marcus, the quiet one, said nothing. His eyes darted back and forth, scanning for any opportunity to escape. But he knew that with so many guards around, escape was impossible. They were trapped. They were marched into a grand palace, the gates opening before them like some ancient temple. The walls were adorned with jewels that sparkled in the dim light, and the floors were made of marble so polished it seemed like glass. The inside was even more overwhelming than the outside. Huge chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting a soft glow across the massive hall. Everything was over the top, grand and intimidating. They were led through long, twisting hallways, the air thick with the smell of alien flowers and spices. Finally, they were brought to a large chamber, where Princess Valara sat on a raised throne. Her eyes studied them carefully as they entered, her gaze sharp and calculating. The humans stood before her, unsure of what to expect. They had never seen an alien quite like her before. Valara was tall, even taller than Jarek, with long silver hair that flowed down her back. Her eyes were a bright, piercing green, almost glowing in the dim light. She was beautiful, but there was something cold about her, something distant. "Welcome," she said, her voice smooth, yet carrying an edge of authority. "I have brought you here to serve me. You will be given tasks, and you will obey my every command. Do not try to escape. You are here by my will, and I expect nothing less than complete loyalty." The humans didn't speak. They were still processing what was happening. They had been pulled from Earth, thrown into a strange world, and now they were being told they were slaves. The thought was maddening. "Do you understand?" Valara asked again, her voice more forceful this time. Jarek, unable to hold back any longer, stepped forward. "We're not your slaves," he said, his voice firm despite the fear gnawing at him. "We were taken against our will, and we're not going to be your servants." Velara's eyes narrowed. "You have no choice," she said simply, her words like ice. "You are mine now. You will do as I say, or face the consequences." Lena stepped forward then, placing a hand on Jarek's arm to stop him. "We're not here to fight," she said calmly, her voice a little shaky but strong enough to hold the princess's attention. "We just want to understand what's going on. We didn't ask for this, but we'll do what we must to survive." Velara's expression softened, just a little. She hadn't expected them to speak back so bravely. It wasn't what she was used to. Most of the creatures she ruled bowed before her, afraid of her power. These humans, though, were different. They weren't scared of her in the way she had expected. They were defiant, but in a way that intrigued her. "You will learn your place here," Velara said, her voice softer now, but still commanding. "I will make sure of it. But know this, I didn't bring you here to harm you. I brought you here because I need you. I have grown tired of being alone." She looked down at her hands, as if the words caused her pain. The humans exchanged confused glances. What was she talking about? Why had she brought them here, if not to use them as slaves? It didn't make sense. "Why us?" Marcus asked, his voice quiet but cutting through the tension in the room. "Why did you bring us here? We're just ordinary humans." Velara lifted her gaze, her green eyes meeting Marcus. "Because you are not ordinary. You are strong, loyal, and resilient. These are things I need. Things I can no longer find in those who serve me." She paused for a moment, as if weighing her next words carefully. "You will be my companions. You will stay by my side, help me with tasks, and perhaps—" She hesitated, but then continued, "Perhaps you will teach me what I've been missing." The humans stood there, speechless. They were not sure if they could trust her. They didn't know what to think about her words. Was she serious? Was she just trying to manipulate them? "I will give you time to think," Velara said, standing up from her throne. "You may rest in your new quarters. When you are ready, I expect you to begin your duties. But know this," she added, her voice low, "I will not allow you to leave. You are here now, and you will remain, one way or another." As the humans were escorted to their quarters, they couldn't help but wonder what their fate would be. Velara had made it clear they were not free. But what she had said about being alone, it troubled them. Was there more to this princess than they realized? For the first time since arriving, they felt a sliver of doubt about their situation. They had been brought here as prisoners, yes, but perhaps there was something else at play. Only time would tell. A secret connection. The days passed in a haze of confusion and tension. Jarek, Lena, and Marcus spent their time in the palace, assigned to different tasks by Princess Velara. They had no choice but to obey, and though their bodies worked hard, their minds were still trapped in the mystery of why they were brought here in the first place. The palace, though grand, felt like a prison. The tall walls and dark corridors seemed to close in on them with each passing day. They were watched constantly by the alien guards, and despite the grand meals and luxurious rooms, they felt no peace. They longed for their old lives on Earth, simple, predictable, free. But now, they were at the mercy of Velara, a mysterious and powerful princess who had made it clear they were not free. Yet, something strange began to happen. Over time, the humans began to notice small moments where the princess would act differently. She would look at them with a strange expression, as if she was studying them, trying to understand them. It wasn't the cold, commanding look she usually gave them. There was something softer in her eyes, a flicker of curiosity, and something more. Lena was the first to notice it. One evening, while she was cleaning the grand hall, she caught a glimpse of Velara standing alone by a window, gazing out into the distance. The princess was usually surrounded by guards or attendants, but this moment was different. It was as if she wanted to be alone, as if she needed to be alone. Lena hesitated, then decided to approach. She walked quietly over to the princess, trying to avoid drawing attention. When Velara noticed her, she didn't react immediately. She simply continued to stare out into the night, her face unreadable. "What are you thinking about?" Lena asked, her voice quiet but kind. Velara's head turned slowly, her green eyes meeting Lena's. For a moment, she didn't answer. Then, in a soft voice, she said, "I was thinking about how alone I feel." Lena was taken aback by the response. She had expected anger, or at least the usual coldness, but instead, Velara seemed vulnerable. It was an emotion Lena wasn't used to seeing in the princess. "Alone," Lena repeated, taking a step closer. "But you have your palace, your people." Velara shook her head, her silver hair falling over her shoulders. "My people, they don't understand me. They obey, but they do not see me. They do not know what it is like to feel different, to be apart from everything and everyone." Lena didn't know what to say. She had always known Velara as a powerful, almost unapproachable ruler. But now, standing here in front of her, she saw something else. Was this why Velara had brought them here? Not just for slaves, but for companionship. "I understand more than you think," Lena said softly. I'm far from home too. I miss my family. I miss Earth." Velara looked at her for a long time, as if she was trying to see the truth in Lena's words. Finally, she nodded. "I know. You do not belong here, just as I do not belong anywhere. But I have to make sure you stay. You have no choice, do you?" Lena nodded, though she couldn't help but feel a small flicker of something else in her heart. Despite the fear, despite the uncertainty, she found herself feeling connected to Velara in some strange way. "I want to understand you," Velara said quietly, almost to herself. "I want to know what makes you different, why you are so strong, even when you are afraid." Lena didn't answer immediately. She wasn't sure what to say. But as she looked at the princess, she realized that maybe they weren't so different after all. They were both trapped in their own worlds, one alien and strange, the other far away, unreachable. And both of them longed for something more. "I don't know if I can help you," Lena said at last, "but I will try." Velara's eyes softened for a moment. "Thank you." Just then, they were interrupted by a guard entering the room. He gave a sharp bow to the princess, then turned to Lena. "It is time for you to return to your quarters," he said, his tone businesslike. Lena glanced at Velara before turning to leave. She wasn't sure what to make of the conversation, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. A connection had been formed, a fragile thread between the two women. The next few days were tense. The humans continued with their tasks, but their interactions with the princess were different. Jarek caught a glimpse of Velara one morning, sitting alone at a large table, staring at a set of strange alien artifacts. When their eyes met, she didn't look away. Instead, she gave him a small, almost imperceptible smile before returning to her work. Marcus, too, had his moments with the princess. Though they were brief and often filled with tension, there was a quiet understanding between them. He had always been the one to stay silent, observing others from the sidelines. But now he felt a strange connection to the princess, one he couldn't explain, but couldn't ignore. In the evenings, when they were all locked in their quarters, the humans would talk about their strange encounters with Velara. They couldn't deny it. Something was changing. The princess was no longer just a cold ruler. There was something else behind her eyes, something they hadn't seen before. And yet they still didn't trust her. They didn't know if they ever could. But Lena, in particular, couldn't shake the feeling that beneath Velara's cold exterior was a woman who needed them, perhaps more than they needed her. What would come of this connection, this strange bond between the princess and the humans? Would it lead to their freedom, or would it drive them deeper into her world? Only time would tell. Planning the escape. The days in the palace felt long and unending. Jarek, Lena, and Marcus continued with their daily tasks, but in their minds, a different plan was taking shape. They knew that they couldn't stay here forever. The palace was not their home, and Vilara, despite her soft moments, was still their captor. The thought of being trapped in this alien world was unbearable. Late one night, when the palace was quiet and the stars shone bright outside their windows, the three humans met in secret. They gathered in the corner of the garden, where the palace walls couldn't hear them. The plants around them were strange, but they gave off a soft glow that made the night feel less lonely. "We need to get out of here," Jarek whispered, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "The longer we stay, the more dangerous it gets. Vilara can't be trusted." Lena nodded, her eyes filled with the same worry. "But how? We don't know the palace well, and we're always watched. There's no way out unless we can find some weakness." Marcus, who had been quiet for most of the meeting, spoke up. "I've been thinking about this. The palace is huge, but there are hidden places. I've seen a few tunnels and passages near the servants' quarters. They might lead outside." Jarek's eyes lit up at the idea. "Tunnels? Are you sure?" Marcus nodded. "I'm certain. The palace was built with secret escape routes, especially for the royal family. We can use them to slip away without anyone noticing." Lena bit her lip, unsure. "That's a risk. We don't know where the tunnels lead, and we might get caught." "We can't stay here," Jarek said firmly. "Even if there's a chance we get caught, we'll have to take it. We have no other choice." The three of them fell silent, each one thinking about the dangers they would face. Vilara might have been kinder to them in recent days, but that didn't change the fact that they were her prisoners. They were nothing more than slaves, and no matter how she treated them, they couldn't forget that. They didn't belong here. They had to return to Earth. After a few moments, Lena spoke again. "What about Vilara? We've seen the way she's been looking at us lately. She seems different. Do you think she'll stop us?" Jarek shook his head. "She may care about us, but that won't stop her from using us. We can't trust her. She's the princess. She'll do what's best for her people, not for us." Marcus agreed. "I've seen her eyes too. There's something behind them, but she's still our captor. We can't forget that." Lena sighed, still conflicted. Maybe we can talk to her first. Try to convince her to let us go." Jarek's face darkened. "That's too dangerous. If she really cared, she wouldn't have brought us here in the first place. She's just playing with us." They all knew the truth. Vilara might have shown them kindness, but that didn't change the reality of their situation. They were trapped in an alien world, with no way to go back home. And it was clear now that she wasn't going to help them escape. It was up to them to get out on their own. The next few days were spent in secret planning. They would take the tunnels Marcus had discovered and try to make their way to freedom. The hardest part was sneaking past the guards. They would have to move quickly and quietly. The guards were everywhere, and getting caught meant punishment, or worse. But the three of them were determined. They worked together, coming up with signals to alert each other if anyone was coming, and planning where they would meet. They needed to move fast, before anyone realized what they were up to. One evening, as the palace settled into its usual routine, they'd made their move. They had waited until the guards were distracted, and then slipped away to the servants' quarters. They had carefully studied the layout of the palace, and now they were going to put their plan into action. As they entered the hidden passage Marcus had spoken of, a sense of relief washed over them. The walls of the tunnel were cool and damp, but it was dark, and that was all that mattered. They moved quickly, following the narrow passage that seemed to wind on forever. They didn't talk. Every step had to be calculated, every sound muffled. After what felt like hours, they reached a large underground chamber. It was silent, and the only sound was the faint echo of their footsteps. They stopped to catch their breath, but their hearts were pounding in their chests. They were so close. They could almost taste their freedom. "We need to move faster," Jarek whispered, glancing around nervously. "I don't trust these tunnels. We don't know where they lead." Marcus nodded and led the way. They continued to walk through the dark, twisting tunnels, their footsteps soft but hurried. They didn't stop until they reached a door, hidden behind a wall of vines and moss. It looked old, like it hadn't been used in years. Jarek pushed the door open carefully, the creaking sound echoing in the quiet tunnel. Beyond it, they could see a faint light, the first sign of the outside world. They stepped through, and the cool night air hit their faces. The stars above looked like a promise of freedom, a hope they hadn't felt since arriving on this strange planet. For the first time in weeks, they felt like they were finally free. But even as they stepped into the open, they knew the hardest part was yet to come. They had to leave the palace and escape the planet itself. The journey ahead was dangerous, but they had made it this far. Together, they could make it all the way. The princess confesses. The cool night air was thick with tension. The trio had made it out of the palace, but they still had a long way to go. The alien landscape stretched out before them, dark and unfamiliar, but their hearts were lighter than they had been in weeks. They knew they couldn't stop here. They needed to keep moving. They had traveled for several hours, the palace far behind them now, when a faint rustling noise broke the silence. Jarek stopped immediately, his senses on high alert. Marcus and Lena froze beside him, all of them straining to listen. "I heard something," Jarek whispered, his voice tense. He peered into the dark forest around them, but there was nothing. Still, the unease in the air felt thick. "It's nothing," Marcus said, trying to sound confident, but he too felt the chill running down his spine. They had been careful, making sure no one had noticed their escape, but the silence felt too thick. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the noise stopped. They cautiously continued, but the peace had been broken. Each step felt heavier now, as if the very ground beneath them sensed their anxiety. Then, out of nowhere, the moonlight was interrupted by a shadow. The figure was tall, almost regal in appearance, and as the light shifted, they recognized her immediately. Velara. Lena gasped in shock. The alien princess stood there, her eyes wide with a mix of confusion and something deeper, something the humans hadn't seen in her before. She wasn't surrounded by guards, and she wasn't armed. She was alone, but there was something in her gaze that made Jarek's heart race. You're supposed to be at the palace," Jarek said, his voice unsure. "Why are you here?" Velara didn't speak immediately. Her eyes flickered between them, scanning each human with intensity. She looked different somehow, vulnerable, like she wasn't the proud princess they had known before. It made their escape feel uncertain. "I followed you," she finally said, her voice soft, almost apologetic. "I couldn't let you go." The humans exchanged surprised glances. What was she saying? Why had she followed them? Velara had been their captor. She had forced them to work for her. Why would she suddenly change her mind? "You couldn't let us go," Marcus asked cautiously. "You're the one who kept us here. We've been slaves under your rule. Why would you follow us?" Velara stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper now. "Because I don't want you to leave." She hesitated, and for the first time, the coldness in her expression faded, replaced by something more human, more fragile. "I'm sorry." Jarek felt a knot form in his stomach. This wasn't the Velara they knew. This wasn't the princess who commanded them like they were nothing. Something had shifted in her, but he couldn't quite understand what it was. "You're sorry," Lena said, shaking her head. "We've been your prisoners. You've treated us like property. And now you're sorry." Velara looked down, her shoulders heavy with guilt. "I didn't want to treat you that way. I was taught to rule with power. I was taught that you were nothing more than tools for my use. But over time, I realized something. I realized I was wrong." Her words hung in the air, as if she was trying to convince herself more than anyone else. Jarek didn't know what to think. Was this a trap? Was she playing with them? Why now? Jarek asked, his voice thick with doubt. Why follow us now, after everything? Velara met his gaze, her eyes filled with regret. Because I care about you. All of you. I was too proud before, too blind, to see what was really happening. You've shown me kindness. And I don't know how to make up for it. But I can't lose you. I can't. The confession hung heavy in the air, like a weight on all of their shoulders. Velara had been the one to keep them locked away, the one who had forced them into her service. But now she was standing before them, vulnerable, offering something that none of them had expected. The truth. Jarek felt a mix of emotions flood through him. Anger, confusion, disbelief. It didn't make sense. How could she say she cared about them now, after everything? She had played the role of their captor for so long. And yet, there was a sincerity in her voice. He could hear it, despite the uncertainty in her eyes. I don't know if I can believe you, Jarek said, his voice softer now, but still firm. You've lied to us, used us. How can we trust you? Velara nodded slowly, accepting his words without argument. I understand. I don't expect you to forgive me. But please know that I've changed. I'm not the person I was. I don't want to be the princess who controls others anymore. Lena crossed her arms, still not convinced. And what do you want from us now? Do you expect us to just forget everything and go back to the palace with you? Velara looked down, her eyes clouded with sadness. I'm asking you to forgive me. But more than that, I'm asking you to stay, not as slaves, but as companions. I want to help you. I want to change everything. The sincerity in her voice was clear, but the humans still didn't know if they could trust her. After everything, how could they just let go of their anger and fear? Jarek took a deep breath, considering her words. We'll never go back as slaves, he said firmly, but we'll hear you out. We'll listen to what you have to say. That's all we can offer. Velara's face softened, a faint smile tugging at her lips. Thank you. That's all I ask. But even as she spoke, the humans knew that trust would not come easily. Velara's confession had opened a door, but it was unclear where that door would lead. The future was uncertain, and the danger still lurked around every corner. The choice. The cold wind howled through the forest, its eerie whistle cutting through the night. The escape had gone smoother than expected, but now the real challenge was just beginning. Velara, the alien princess who had once ruled over them with an iron fist, was now standing in front of them, vulnerable and apologetic. She had followed them into the wilderness, confessing her change of heart. But despite her words, trust didn't come easily. Jarek paced nervously, his mind racing with questions. Could they really believe her? Could they trust someone who had treated them as nothing more than tools? He didn't know. He had seen too much pain, too many betrayals, to let his guard down so easily. Lena, standing quietly beside him, looked at Velara with a mixture of skepticism and curiosity. You say you've changed, Lena began, her voice steady. But how do we know it's not another trick? How do we know we won't end up back in chains? Velara lowered her gaze, a shadow of sadness passing over her face. I don't blame you for being cautious, she replied softly. I've hurt you all, and I don't expect you to forgive me overnight. But I swear to you, I will do everything in my power to make things right. Marcus, who had been silent up until now, stepped forward. His eyes narrowed as he studied the princess. You say you want to help us. But why? What do you gain from this? You could go back to your palace, to your throne, to your power. Why throw all that away for us? Velara's eyes flickered, as if the question had caught her off guard. For a moment, she didn't answer, her expression distant. Then, slowly, she spoke. I don't want power anymore. I thought that was everything I needed, but I was wrong. I don't want to rule. I want freedom. Freedom from the rules that bound me, from the expectations that I had to meet. I want to live for something more. I want to live for people, not for power. Her words were genuine, and the way she said them made Jarek feel a strange pull in his chest. It was hard to imagine that the same woman who had once treated them like prisoners was standing before them now, asking for their trust. But even with her sincerity, Jarek couldn't help but question her motives. Lena sighed, rubbing her temples. "So, what now? You want us to join you? To help you escape everything you've known and live in some utopia?" "I don't know," Valera admitted. "I don't know what the future holds. But I know that I'm not the same person I was. I'm not asking for your forgiveness or for you to trust me right away. I just want you to understand that I won't force you to do anything you don't want to do." The air was thick with tension as the group stood in silence, each one trying to make sense of what had just been said. Jarek could see the uncertainty in Lena's eyes, the skepticism that still lingered in Marcus's stance, and yet something in Valera's voice, something in her vulnerability, seemed to reach them. Jarek took a deep breath and turned to his companions. "We've come this far. I think we deserve a choice, a real choice. We can either walk away from all of this and go our separate ways, or we can stay together and figure out what comes next. But we can't keep running. We need to decide what kind of life we want." Lena and Marcus nodded in agreement. Jarek could see that they were still unsure, but they knew that they couldn't keep hiding forever. At some point, they would have to confront the reality of their situation and make a choice. Valera watched them, waiting for their response. Her face was still soft, but there was a hint of fear in her eyes now. She understood the gravity of their decision. She knew that if they chose to walk away, it would be the end of everything. But if they chose to stay, things would change forever. "We can't go back," Lena said suddenly, breaking the silence. "We can't go back to the way things were. Not after everything that's happened. But I don't know if I can trust you, Valera." "Not yet." Valera nodded, her expression resigned. "I understand. I don't expect you to trust me right away. All I ask is that you give me a chance to prove that I've changed." Jarek looked at Marcus, who seemed lost in thought. "What do you think?" Jarek asked. Marcus sighed, rubbing his neck. "I think we've come too far to turn back now. And we don't have much of a choice, do we? We've all been running from something. From our pasts. From the people we were before. Maybe this is our chance to start over." Jarek nodded slowly, feeling the weight of his decision. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. This was a turning point. They could keep running, keep hiding, but they would always be haunted by their past. Or they could take a leap of faith and trust that things could be different. He turned to Valera, who was watching him with a mixture of hope and fear. "All right," Jarek said, his voice steady. "We'll stay. We'll stay and see where this leads." Valera's eyes widened in disbelief, and for a moment, she didn't know how to react. She had expected them to turn her away, to reject her once again. But now, with their choice made, something inside her shifted. It wasn't just relief, it was a new sense of hope. She had been given a chance, and she would do everything she could to make sure it wasn't wasted. "Thank you," Valera whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I won't let you down. I promise." Jarek didn't know what the future held. He didn't know if they would be able to build a new life together, or if they would eventually fall apart. But one thing was certain. This was their choice, and they had made it together. As they set off into the unknown, with the stars above them and the future ahead, they knew that the road wouldn't be easy. But for the first time, they felt that they had control. They were no longer prisoners of their past. They were free to choose their own destiny. And that, for now, was enough. A new rule. The sun was beginning to rise over the distant horizon, casting a soft golden glow over the landscape. The group had made their way deeper into the forest, far from the castle and the life they had known. It felt like a new beginning, but they all knew that starting over wasn't going to be easy. There were still questions, still doubts. The world outside was vast and dangerous, and they were no longer part of the royal court. They were free, but they also had to learn how to survive. Valera stood at the edge of the clearing, staring out into the vast unknown. The weight of her past was heavy on her shoulders, but she had made a promise to the humans who had chosen to trust her, to the people who had given her a second chance. Now, it was time for her to prove that she was worthy of that trust. Jarek, Lena, and Marcus were gathered around a small fire, talking quietly amongst themselves. It was the first peaceful morning they had shared in a long time. The air was fresh, the scent of the forest, a welcome change from the cold stone walls of the palace. They had spent the night in silence, reflecting on their decision. But now, it was time to face the future. Valera approached them slowly, her footsteps quiet on the forest floor. She didn't want to interrupt their conversation, but she knew she had to speak up. It was time to set the rules, to establish the foundation of their new life together. "Good morning," Valera said softly, her voice carrying a hint of nervousness. She wasn't used to speaking as an equal. She had always been the one in charge, the one giving orders. But now, that wasn't her role. She was no longer the princess of a vast empire. She was just one of them. Jarek looked up, offering her a small smile. "Morning, Valera," he replied. "How are you feeling?" Valera hesitated for a moment, her eyes scanning the faces of the group. There was no hostility, no fear in their gazes, but there was still something unspoken between them. The tension hadn't completely disappeared, and she knew it would take time for it to fade. "I'm adjusting," Valera admitted. "It's strange, not having people bow to me, not having power over others, but I think I'm starting to understand what freedom truly means." Lena nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Freedom isn't just about having the power to do whatever you want. It's about making choices, being responsible for those choices. We're all in this together now." Valera's heart swelled with gratitude. These humans, who had once been her slaves, were now teaching her something she had never learned in the palace. They were showing her what it meant to be free, not just in body, but in spirit. "I know I can't change the past," Valera said quietly. "But I want to create a new future. I want to build something with all of you, something real. And I think we need to set some rules, some boundaries, so we know where we stand." Jarek raised an eyebrow. "Rules?" he asked, glancing at the others. "What do you mean?" Valera took a deep breath, her hands shaking slightly as she clasped them together. "I know we've all been through a lot, but we need to agree on how we move forward. We can't just live without structure. We need to respect each other, support each other, and make sure that no one is left behind. That's the only way we'll survive out here." Lena leaned forward, her eyes bright with interest. "So, what kind of rules are we talking about?" Valera thought for a moment. "First, we need to be honest with each other. No more secrets. We need to trust each other, and that can't happen if we're hiding things. If something's bothering us, we talk about it. No more keeping things in." Marcus crossed his arms, looking skeptical. "That sounds easy enough, but what if one of us doesn't follow the rules?" Valera's gaze hardened slightly. "Then we hold each other accountable. We're all responsible for making this work. If someone steps out of line, we talk about it. But we do it as equals, not as master and servant." Jarek nodded. "Sounds fair. What else?" Valera took a deep breath before continuing. "We need to help each other. Everyone should have a role. We all have strengths, and we need to use them to survive. Whether it's hunting, building shelter, or protecting each other, we all pitch in. No one is above the others." Lena smiled. "That's something I can get behind." There was a moment of silence, and then Marcus spoke up again. "What about the future? What if we want to go our separate ways someday? What happens then?" Valera looked at each of them, her expression softening. "That's something we'll have to cross when we get there. For now, we stick together. But if one of us wants to leave, we won't stop them. No one will be forced to stay. But we need to make sure we're all clear about that from the start. Jarek looked around at the group, seeing the uncertain expressions on their faces. He could tell that they were still processing everything. This wasn't going to be easy, but they had made it this far, and there was no turning back now. "All right," Jarek said, standing up and stretching. "Let's make this work. We all have our reasons for being here. We all have our goals. But as long as we remember the rules, we'll get through it together." Valara's heart lifted at his words. For the first time, she felt like she truly belonged. They weren't her servants anymore. They were her equals, her companions. And together, they would carve out a new life for themselves, one without the chains of the past. As they set off toward their new future, the weight of the old world seemed to slip away. There was no more royalty, no more palace. There was only the open road and the promise of a new life, a life where they would rule themselves.